Hello and welcome to the Ageless Takes channel, where we delve into some of the most intriguing and mysterious cases of all time. Today, we're diving into the gripping story of the Murdaugh Murders, a case that has left law enforcement and the public alike scratching their heads for years. Imagine a beautiful summer evening in South Carolina, a tranquil rural hamlet surrounded by lush greenery, suddenly shattered by the horrific discovery of two bodies, that of Maggie Murdaugh, a loving wife and mother, and her son, Paul, a young man with a bright future ahead of him. The murders sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community, and the quest for justice began. But, as we delve deeper into the case, we uncover a string of other mysterious deaths that have plagued the Murdaugh family for generations. Each death adds another layer to the puzzle, leaving us with more questions than answers. But as the months went by, the case seemed to hit a dead end, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. That's when our very own Sherlock Holmes stepped in, and with his unparalleled detective skills, he sets out to uncover the truth behind the Murdaugh murders. Will our Sherlock Holmes be able to solve the case that has stumped the authorities for so long? Join us as we follow his every step, as he pieces together the evidence, and unravels the mystery that lies at the heart of the Murdaugh murders. Get ready for a thrilling and captivating journey as we delve into the story of the Murdaugh murders. Detective Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson were summoned to the sunny state of South Carolina, where a shocking murder had taken place. The Murdaugh family, with a legal heritage that dates back 100 years, was now at the center of a heinous crime that had taken the lives of a wife and son. The prime suspect, Alex Murdaugh, was a man with a troubled past, having been accused of financial fraud and even attempting to stage his own suicide. As Holmes and Watson delved deeper into the case, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of lies and deceit. The motive behind the murder was as shrouded in mystery as the identity of the killer. Was it truly Alex Murdaugh, as the prosecutors claimed, or was there something more sinister afoot? Holmes and Watson set out to solve the mystery and bring the true culprit to justice. They gathered evidence, questioned witnesses, and followed leads, all in the pursuit of the truth. And as they closed in on the answer, they realized that the case was much more complex than they had initially imagined. In the end, it was up to the brilliant mind of Sherlock Holmes and his dear Watson to piece together the puzzle and solve the murder. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson arrived in South Carolina with a sense of intrigue. They had heard rumors of a legal dynasty in the state, a family whose roots went back 100 years to a one-man law office run by Randolph Murdaugh. As they delved into the history of the Murdaugh family, they learned of a legacy that spanned generations, of father and son following in each other's footsteps to become the chief prosecutor of a 5-county region. The legacy of the Murdaugh family was one of service and dedication, but now, it was being tarnished by a shocking murder and allegations of financial fraud. As Holmes and Watson set out to investigate the case, they realized that the legacy of the Murdaugh family was closely tied to the murder itself. With each step of their investigation, they uncovered more about the Murdaugh legal dynasty. They learned of the elder Randolph Murdaugh, who served as the chief prosecutor for 2 decades before his untimely death in a train crash. They learned of Randolph Murdaugh Jr., known as Buster, who took up his father's mantle and served for 46 years. And they learned of Randolph Murdaugh III, Alex Murdaugh's father, who was elected to the same position and served until 2006. Alex Murdaugh, the man at the center of the current scandal, was a curious figure. He never ran for the prosecutor job, but he had served as a volunteer prosecutor and helped his father with cases. However, by September 2021, he was officially removed from that role. As they pieced together the history of the Murdaugh family, Holmes and Watson realized that the legacy of the family was intricately connected to the murder. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the killing and bring justice to the Murdaugh family, no matter what it took. As Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson arrived in South Carolina to investigate the mysterious deaths of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, they discovered a family with a long and dark history in the state. The Murdaugh legal dynasty went back generations, with each generation serving as chief prosecutor for the region. However, as they dug deeper into the family's past, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of unexplained deaths. One such case was the death of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old man whose body was found on a road near the Murdaugh home. Despite initial investigations into his death, no arrests were ever made and the cause of his death remains a mystery. The police files suggested that he may have run out of gas on the side of the road several miles away from where his body was found, but no concrete evidence has ever been found. Although it was initially investigated as a possible shooting and then a hit and run, the case had never been fully solved. However, rumors of a hidden relationship between Stephen Smith and Alex Murdaugh's son, Buster Murdaugh, had started to circulate. Sherlock and Watson were determined to uncover the truth behind Stephen Smith's death and the connection, if any, to the Murdaugh family. As they delved deeper into the case, they discovered a web of secrets and hidden motives that would ultimately lead to the truth behind the mysterious murders. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were following a trail of dark secrets that surrounded the Murdaugh family. The latest information they had come across was the mysterious death of a long-serving housekeeper at the Murdaugh's household, Gloria Satterfield. In 2018, Gloria had fallen at the Murdaugh's home and died from her injuries several weeks later. After her funeral, Alex Murdaugh had introduced her two adult sons to a lawyer who he claimed would help them resolve the issues around their mother's death. But the sons claimed in a lawsuit that they did not know that the lawyer, Corey Fleming, was a close friend of Mr. Murdaugh's. The lawsuit also stated that they never received any money from the $4.3 million settlement that Mr. Murdaugh and his insurers reached with the lawyer. In 2022, Alex Murdaugh was arrested for charges related to the missing settlement funds. He admitted to owing her sons the full settlement plus lawyers' fees, $4.3 million in all. The police were also investigating the cause of Ms. Satterfield's death, which was initially reported as natural on her death certificate but was now believed to have been caused by an accidental fall. The police announced in June 2022 that they had received permission from Ms. Satterfield's family to exhume her body and get to the bottom of her mysterious death. With these new developments, Sherlock and Watson were determined to unravel the truth behind this strange and unfortunate death. Sherlock and Watson were stunned as they delved deeper into the dark history of the Murdaugh family, uncovering one tragic event after another. The latest to surface was the deadly boat crash that had taken place in 2019. Paul Murdaugh, who was now deceased, had been charged with drunkenly operating the boat that resulted in the death of one of its passengers, 19-year-old Mallory Beach, and severe injuries to several others. Controversial details surrounding the case were coming to light, with questions arising on whether the police had been lax in their investigation or had shown favoritism towards Paul. One of the passengers on the boat claimed that Paul had been at the wheel, but a report by a Department of Natural Resources officer stated otherwise. The South Carolina Attorney General's office was still investigating the crash, which had resulted in Paul being charged with multiple felonies, including boating under the influence causing death. The tragedy had also led to a lawsuit against Paul's father, Alex Murdaugh, and several others, with the plaintiffs seeking to hold them accountable for the crash. The Beach family's lawyer was applying pressure on Alex to reveal his finances, and a hearing was scheduled just 3 days after the murders occurred. Prosecutors now suspected that Alex's motive for the killings was to gain sympathy and hide his financial misconduct. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson found themselves in the midst of a web of mystery as they uncovered the dark events surrounding Alex Murdaugh. The case took a shocking turn when, nearly 3 months after the killing of Murdaugh's wife and son, an employee at his family's law firm discovered a check made out to Murdaugh instead of the firm. This sparked an investigation into his financial dealings, resulting in his resignation. The following day, Murdaugh reported that he had been shot in the head while changing a tire on the side of a rural road. However, his story quickly unraveled as it was revealed that he had been with his friend and cousin, Curtis Edward Smith. The truth behind the shooting came to light as Murdaugh admitted to having asked Smith to shoot him in a staged murder attempt in hopes of helping his older son collect on his life insurance policy. Murdaugh's admission led to his and Smith's arrest, with Smith being charged with aggravated assault, assisted suicide, and insurance fraud. The incident sparked further investigation into their activities, and in July 2022, both were indicted for conspiracy and money laundering related to distributing oxycodone. The story took a final, unexpected turn when Mr. Smith revealed that the gun had gone off by accident and that he was not the one who pulled the trigger. The case of Alex Murdaugh's shooting left both Sherlock and Watson in disbelief as they pieced together the events surrounding one man's descent into darkness. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were tasked with unraveling the mystery behind the Murdaugh murders. The sudden and brutal death of Alex Murdaugh's wife, Maggie, and their 22-year-old son Paul had left the Low-Country region in a state of shock and terror. The Murdaugh family was well known in the area, having established a powerful and influential legal dynasty. The killings were simply referred to as the Murdaugh Murders, a dark chapter in the family's history. Despite the initial outpouring of condolences and support for the Murdaugh family, suspicion soon began to fall on Alex himself. According to his testimony, he had discovered the bodies of his wife and son at the family's remote home in Islington, a small hamlet located 65 miles west of Charleston. But phone records indicated that Alex had left his home earlier that night, to visit his mother, before returning to find the bodies. Prosecutors pointed to this discrepancy as evidence that Alex was, in fact, the killer. The audio recording of his 911 call was the only real insight into Alex's state of mind on that fateful night. The sound of his voice, a mix of distress and desperation, was haunting. "I've been up to it now, it's bad," he told the dispatcher. "Are they close, Mom?" His pleas for help were met with a flurry of activity as law enforcement officers rushed to the scene. When the officers arrived, Alex told them that his son Paul had been receiving threats due to a fatal boat crash he had been involved in a couple of years prior. At the time of his death, Paul had been facing serious felonies related to the crash. The authorities discovered shell casings at the scene, and called in a tow truck company, as they searched for any potential surveillance footage from neighboring homes and businesses. But the police reports were heavily redacted, and it was unclear whether any significant evidence had been found. As Sherlock and Watson continued their investigation, they were determined to uncover the truth and bring the real culprit to justice. The Murdaugh murders were a complex and puzzling case, but they were determined to unravel the lies and get to the bottom of what really happened that fateful night. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson arrived at the scene of the double homicide at the Murdaugh property, a sprawling estate with several buildings and vast open fields. They were greeted by a somber Alex Murdaugh, who led them to the canine kennel where his son and wife had been shot to death. Holmes and Watson began their investigation by examining the feed/mudroom where Paul Murdaugh had been killed. The room was in disarray, with feed bags and mud-caked boots scattered about. 2 large bullet holes marked the wall where Paul had been shot. Holmes carefully examined the room, taking note of every detail, from the angle of the shots to the state of the floor. Next, they made their way to the covered sidewalk where Paul had been discovered. The cement walkway was stained with blood, and Holmes examined the body, noting the position and angle of the wounds. He then turned his attention to the repurposed airplane hangar where Maggie Murdaugh had been killed. He examined the floor, noting the location and angle of the shots. He then stepped outside to view the surrounding area, looking for any signs of struggle or footprints. Watson, meanwhile, had been speaking with Alex Murdaugh, who told them about his discovery of the bodies. He explained that he had been away from the property and had returned to find his son and wife murdered. Holmes and Watson continued their investigation, examining the other buildings and outbuildings on the property, looking for any clues that might lead them to the killer. They found nothing out of the ordinary, but Holmes was not discouraged. He was determined to solve this case and bring the killer to justice. As they made their way back to their lodgings, Holmes began to piece together the events of the murders. He was certain that the key to solving the case lay in the details, and he was eager to delve deeper into the investigation. The Murdaugh murders would prove to be one of the greatest challenges of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson's careers, but they were determined to solve it and bring the killer to justice. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson arrived at the kennel where Margaret Murdaugh had been shot to death. They were greeted by a solemn Alex Murdaugh, who led them to his wife's body. Holmes examined the body, noting the position and angle of the wounds. He determined that this wound was the cause of Margaret's immediate and terminal death. Watson, meanwhile, was examining the gunshot wound to the left wrist. He noted that the entrance was on the dorsal side and the exit was on the ventral side, which was non-fatal. Holmes then turned his attention to the gunshot wound to the left thigh, which was a front-to-back, downward shot that entered on the medial side and exited on the back of the thigh. He observed that the wound contained stippling and no soot, which was also non-fatal. Next, they examined the gunshot wound to the back of the scalp, which was on the right side and had caused a terminal and severe brain injury. The bullet had exited the head and traveled into the upper shoulder/back area, at a downward trajectory. Lastly, they looked at the gunshot wound to the upper abdomen, which was a potentially fatal shot that had entered on the right side and exited on the lower left side of the back. This wound also contained stippling and no soot, and had a similar angle to the wound on the left thigh. As they finished their examination, Holmes and Watson discussed the details of Margaret's wounds and the potential motives for her murder. They were determined to find the killer and bring them to justice. Sherlock and Dr. Watson approached the body of Paul Murdaugh with the utmost care, both aware of the importance of their examination in uncovering the truth about what happened at the canine kennel. They meticulously documented each wound and took note of every detail that could offer insight into the events leading up to Paul's death. As they studied the wounds, Sherlock's mind raced with possibilities. He pondered the nature of the buckshot wound to Paul's chest, and the presence of the pink plastic wad in the exit chest wound. He knew that the use of buckshot indicated that the shooter was likely using a shotgun, and that the pink plastic wad was likely a part of the shotgun shell casing. Meanwhile, Dr. Watson focused on the wound to Paul's shoulder and head. The two men worked in silence, carefully analyzing the wounds and piecing together a narrative of what might have taken place at the canine kennel. After a thorough examination, they stepped back from Paul's body, each lost in thought as they tried to make sense of the evidence before them. "It's clear that both Paul and Margaret were shot with different firearms," Sherlock said, breaking the silence. "The wounds on Margaret suggest a rifle was used, while the wounds on Paul indicate a shotgun." Dr. Watson nodded in agreement. "It seems as though Paul was shot first, based on the trajectory of the wounds." Sherlock stroked his chin, his mind working to put the pieces together. "We must also consider the fact that Margaret had a non-fatal wound to her wrist. This suggests a struggle or an attempt to defend herself. Yes, it's possible that Paul was shot in the struggle and Margaret was shot after," added Dr. Watson. The two men exchanged a knowing look, both understanding the importance of their findings in solving the Murdaugh murders. They were determined to uncover the truth and bring justice to the Murdaugh family. Sherlock and Dr. Watson stood over the body of Paul Murdaugh, studying the wounds in silence. Sherlock's keen eyes were focused on the details of the 2 shotgun wounds, while Watson's mind was working to piece together the sequence of events that led to Paul's death. Finally, Sherlock spoke up, his voice low and thoughtful. "Watson, what do you make of these wounds?" Watson looked up at his friend, studying the wounds himself before responding. "It appears to me that the shot along the midline of Paul's chest was the first wound that he sustained." Sherlock nodded, deep in thought. "Yes, that would seem to be the case. But we must also consider the position of the shooter." Watson frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. It would seem that the shooter was positioned to the left of Paul when the first shot was fired, and then moved to the right for the second shot. Sherlock nodded again, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "Excellent, Watson. These questions will be crucial in helping us to determine the identity of the murderer." The 2 detectives spent several more hours at the crime scene, gathering evidence and piecing together the events that led to the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. With each new discovery, they came closer to uncovering the truth and bringing the murderer to justice. Sherlock and Watson were carefully analyzing the first wound on Paul Murdaugh's body. The buck wound to the chest had penetrated from several feet away, with the young man facing slightly to the southwest at the time of the shot. Further examination showed that most of it had then entered the underside of Paul's left arm and exited again on the outside of the upper arm. The path of at least 7 buckshot pellets continued through the window panes at the rear of the feed room, suggesting that the shooter was standing several feet away from Paul at the time of the shot. An open shot cup or wad was visible under Paul's left arm, and 90 or near 90-degree blood drops on the cement showed that Paul was still standing but moving slowly towards the door. Partial footwear impressions in the blood droplets supported Paul's movement towards the door. The location of the fired shot shell behind the door, and the continued path of the buckshot through the window panes, would place the shooter standing in or slightly outside the room door, approximately midline of the feed room, with the breech of the shotgun inside the room. This was a crucial piece of information in determining the shooter's position, and their actions leading up to the incident. Sherlock and Watson stood at the threshold of the feed room, staring at the gruesome evidence of the second wound. They were both experienced detectives, but even they were taken aback by the violence and finality of it. "This shot was delivered by a shot shell of small shot," Watson remarked, "which is a stark contrast to the first wound." Sherlock nodded, his eyes flicking back and forth as he took in the various details of the scene. The length of the shotgun would provide more certainty, but it is unlikely that the shooter was standing with a shoulder-mounted weapon at the time of the second discharge. The 2 detectives shared a knowing look, both realizing that this information was crucial in determining the shooter's position and motive. They made a mental note to follow up on the type and length of shotgun used in the shooting. "Come, Watson," Sherlock said, turning to leave the feed room. "We have much more work to do if we're to get to the bottom of this." Detective Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson next find Margaret's body lying on the ground. The 2 men carefully examined the body, noting the 5 gunshot wounds. As they studied each wound, they began to piece together a sequence of events. It appeared that the first 3 wounds, to the left thigh, upper abdomen, and left wrist, were delivered while Margaret was upright or semi-upright. However, the final 2 shots, to the left side of the torso and crown of the head, appeared to have been delivered when Margaret was prone or nearly prone, propping herself up on her knees and at least her right hand. Dr. Watson's expertise in forensic pathology was invaluable, as he explained the nature of each wound and the likely trajectory of the shots. It was his professional opinion that the first shot was delivered from behind Margaret's left side, followed by the other 3 shots, and finally the 2 shots that caused her immediate incapacitation. Detective Holmes was struck by the precise attention to detail and the scientific method used by Dr. Watson in his examination of the body. He knew that the information they gathered at the crime scene would be critical in solving this case. As they continued their investigation, they searched for any evidence that could shed light on the sequence of events, such as the location of cartridge casings and the physical location and position of the deceased. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Detective Holmes and Dr. Watson were determined to uncover the truth behind Margaret's death. They were confident that with their combined skills and expertise, they would be able to solve this case and bring justice to the victim and her loved ones. Detective Holmes and Dr. Watson began to question Alex Murdaugh about the blood stains on his white t-shirt. Alex claimed that he had no idea how the stains got there, but the experts were skeptical. They had treated the stains with leucocrystal violet and noticed that the smaller stains were consistent with high-velocity impact stains, which are typically caused by a gunshot or high-speed machinery. The larger stains were not consistent with backspatter from a gunshot, but rather transfer from another object. As they continued to question Alex, they noticed that he seemed nervous and fidgety, his eyes darting back and forth. He kept rubbing the area where the blood stains were located on his shirt, as if he was trying to hide something. Holmes and Watson looked at each other, both sensing that there was more to the story than what Alex was telling them. They decided to perform a series of tests to determine the exact cause of the stains and whether or not they were consistent with backspatter from a gunshot. The results of these tests would be crucial in solving the case and finding out what really happened. Meanwhile, Alex's behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. It was only a matter of time before Holmes and Watson would uncover the truth. Sherlock and Watson examined the photographs and videos carefully, trying to piece together what may have happened based on the evidence before them. It appears, says Sherlock, that Alex was using the t-shirt to wipe his face and forehead, which would explain the larger stain near the bottom front of the garment. However, the smaller stains near the top neck and chest area are a bit more intriguing. They appear to be completely different from the larger stain. Watson nods in agreement. I agree, Sherlock. The smaller stains seem to be more consistent with high-velocity impact stains, as the expert indicated in their analysis. This raises more questions about what may have happened. Sherlock nods thoughtfully. Indeed, Watson. It would seem that the t-shirt was used to clean up after a more violent event. We must consider what could have caused these high-velocity impact stains, and whether they are consistent with a gunshot. Watson nods, and they both fall silent, lost in thought as they try to put together the pieces of this mystery. It's clear that they will have to continue their investigation to get to the bottom of what happened to Alex Murdaugh and what may have caused the blood stains on his t-shirt. As Sherlock and Watson examine the stains on Alex Murdaugh's t-shirt, they begin to piece together a possible scenario of what could have happened. Watson notices the larger stain near the front bottom of the shirt, pointing out that the BWC video depicts Alex wiping his face and forehead with this area. It is my opinion, says Sherlock, that the bottom stain is representative of a transfer of spatter from one area to the shirt by way of a wipe. He explains that a wipe is when an object, in this case Alex's hands, meets another object, the t-shirt, that already contains blood. Watson nods, taking in the information. The shirt could have wiped the blood from the face or forehead, he says. But the smaller stains at the top of the shirt, near the neck and chest area, present a different story. The 100+ smaller stains are distinctly different and do not represent a transfer from wiping the face, Sherlock states. The two detectives continue to ponder the meaning behind the stains, using their vast knowledge and experience to piece together the events of the night. With every detail they uncover, they inch closer to the truth. The act of attempting to roll one of the bodies over would produce elongated type spatter stains, but these would likely be limited to a low level. Holmes and Watson continued to consider this information as they delved deeper into their investigation. They knew that the type of blood stains on Alex's face would be critical in determining whether he had indeed been involved in the murders. As they pondered the possibilities, they couldn't help but feel the weight of their responsibility to solve the case and bring justice to the victims. As Sherlock and Watson sifted through the evidence, they couldn't help but be struck by the complexity of the case. The information from the gunshot wounds on Margaret only seemed to raise more questions, rather than providing concrete answers. However, one thing was clear: determining the exact position of the shooter was going to be a challenge. Despite the difficulties, they were determined to piece together what happened that fateful night. They went over the details of the gunshot wounds again and again, analyzing the bullet path, stippling, and physical damage caused. Sherlock also made note of the fact that even the location of the cartridge casings would only provide a possible location for the shooter, as the movements of both Margaret and the shooter were unknown. "This case is shaping up to be quite the puzzle, Watson," Sherlock said, as he leaned back in his chair. "But we'll piece it together, one step at a time." Watson nodded in agreement. "Indeed, Holmes. We have a lot of work to do, but I have faith that we'll find the answers we're looking for." And so, with their minds focused and their determination unwavering, Sherlock and Watson continued their investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind Margaret's shooting. Sherlock and Watson continued to study the T-shirt, now focusing on the impact of the environment and physical manipulation on the stains. Watson noted the importance of proper drying and handling in order to preserve the appearance of the stains. "Yes, my dear Watson, you are quite correct," said Holmes. "It is crucial to understand the effects of environmental factors and physical manipulation on blood stains in order to accurately interpret them. We must consider how the T-shirt was handled and stored, and whether it was exposed to any extreme conditions that could have altered its appearance." "Exactly, Holmes," replied Watson. "We must also take into account that even with proper handling and storage, the stains may fade over time. This is why it is important to process and preserve the T-shirt as soon as possible after it is collected as evidence." Holmes nodded in agreement, his sharp mind already turning to the next step in the investigation. "We must consider all of these factors when analyzing the blood stains on the T-shirt, and use them in conjunction with the other evidence we have gathered in order to build a complete picture of the events that took place." Holmes and Watson continued their investigation into the case, delving deeper into the details of the crime scene. As they went over the findings, they considered the possibility of backspatter on the shooter for both victims, Paul and Margaret. The amount of spatter would increase if the shooter was positioned closer to the muzzle end of the weapon, due to an increase in angle and gravity. Watson pointed out that this evidence could be a crucial piece of the puzzle in determining who the shooter was. Holmes nodded in agreement, but added that the presence of blood droplets and tissue would be very small and would not be enough to positively identify the shooter. As for Margaret, Sherlock theorized that the only gunshot wound that would produce backspatter would be GSW number 4. However, the wound would not project blood and tissue far enough to contaminate the shooter in most cases. The two detectives continued to examine the information they had gathered and to brainstorm possible theories. They knew that piecing together the events of the shooting would not be an easy task, but they were determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Dr. Watson and Sherlock stood over the body of Paul, trying to piece together the events that led to his untimely demise. As they observed the wounds, Sherlock noticed the stippling on Paul's left side of the chest, which would indicate that the shot was fired from a close range. "Interesting, Watson," Sherlock said, scratching his chin. "This stippling could suggest that the shot was fired from close range, but it does not necessarily mean that there was a struggle between Paul and the shooter." Dr. Watson nodded in agreement. Indeed, the angle of Paul's body would also suggest that he was not facing his attacker at the time of the shooting. It is possible that he was caught off guard, or that the shooter simply approached him from behind. Sherlock took a step back and surveyed the scene, his eyes flicking back and forth as he took in every detail. "No, Watson, I do not believe there was a struggle between Paul and the shooter. The lack of any physical evidence supporting a struggle, such as defensive wounds or signs of a struggle in the surrounding area, suggests to me that this was a sudden and unexpected attack. Dr. Watson sighed heavily, looking down at Paul's body with a mix of sadness and determination. We must work even harder to bring justice to Paul, then. The shooter must be caught and brought to trial for their crimes. Sherlock gave a small smile and clapped Dr. Watson on the shoulder. Indeed, my friend. We shall not rest until the truth is uncovered and justice is served. Sherlock and Dr. Watson concluded, based on the physical evidence, that it is highly unlikely that the shooter was prone or kneeling at the time of the shoulder headshot. The angle of the gunshot wound, combined with the blood spatter patterns and the position of the brain, all point towards the shooter being outside the door to the west side of entry, and most likely not in a prone or kneeling position. However, without knowing the exact length of the shotgun used, it is difficult to state with complete certainty. Nevertheless, the evidence strongly supports the shooter being in an upright position, possibly holding a shouldered weapon, at the time of the second discharge. Sherlock and Dr. Watson stood in the feed room where the murder had taken place, analyzing the crime scene for any clues that could lead them to the killer. The cell phone of the victim, Paul, had been found on top of his rear pocket, which was an important piece of evidence in the case. Watson, what do you think about the cell phone? Sherlock asked as he examined the phone. Well, it's clear that the phone was removed from Paul's pocket by someone other than him, Watson replied. The blood stain inside the pocket was produced during the phone's retrieval and before it was placed on top of the pocket. Sherlock nodded in agreement. Yes, and the fact that the elastic on top of the pocket had transferred some blood onto the phone suggests that whoever removed the phone did so in a hurry and without much care. This could indicate that the killer was in a rush to leave the scene of the crime. But why would the killer take the time to remove the phone, but leave Paul's wallet in his pocket? Watson asked. That's a good point, Watson, Sherlock replied. Perhaps the killer was trying to erase any trace of Paul's identity, or maybe he was looking for something specific on the phone. Either way, the cell phone is a critical piece of evidence in this case. So what do we do now, Holmes? We'll need to analyze the phone's data and see if there are any calls or messages that could give us a clue as to who the killer might be. The phone may hold the key to solving this case. And with that, Sherlock and Watson got to work, determined to use the cell phone as a tool to uncover the truth about Paul's death and bring the killer to justice. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stood in the Murdaugh property, surrounded by the evidence they had gathered in their investigation of the shooting of Paul and Margaret Murdaugh. The case had been a complex and challenging one, but their relentless pursuit of the truth had led them to the door of one man, Alex Murdaugh. As they reviewed the evidence one final time, Sherlock's eyes narrowed and he stated with conviction, "The pieces of the puzzle are all here, Watson. The stippling on the chest wound, the trajectory of the second shot, the position of the cell phone, and the motive for insurance fraud. It all points to Alex Murdaugh as the shooter." Watson nodded in agreement, and the two men set to work piecing together the evidence in a manner that would be irrefutable in court. They meticulously documented each piece of evidence and the connections between them, working tirelessly to ensure that justice would be served. Days later, their hard work paid off. Alex Murdaugh was officially indicted for the shootings of his son and wife. "Well done, Holmes," said Watson, a small smile playing on his lips. "Your deductive reasoning has once again proven its worth." Holmes nodded, his piercing blue eyes scanning the bustling street. "It is always satisfying to bring justice to those who have suffered such tragedy," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of emotion. "But the real truth will be revealed in the trial, and I have no doubt that we will be called upon to assist in the proceedings." Watson placed a hand on Holmes' arm, a gesture that was becoming increasingly common between the two men. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "Let us return to Baker Street and celebrate this small victory with some cigars and a glass of brandy." Watson grinned. "It's always a good day when we can put another criminal behind bars," he said, as they made their way down the busy street, their footsteps echoing in unison. Together, they continued to fight for justice, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They both knew that they would always stand by each other, no matter what challenges lay ahead.